This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Celinska. I'm your host and the founder of the Voice of Early Childhood. And today I have with me Lewis Fogarty, who is the director at Always Growing and lecturer at Brunel University. So thank you so much, Lewis, for joining on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so it's great to have you because I know that we're talking about something that you're quite passionate about, and it's all about finding your voice as an educator. And this is really about advocating for collective change in early childhood settings. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my time in the sector and the experiences I've had in a range of settings and with a range of professionals in early years, it's a common thread that I find is missing, I suppose, in so many wonderful people.
Yeah. So the work that I do is all about advocating for the sector, and that includes advocating for those practitioners, educators, managers, leaders, students working in the sector, as well as families and the children themselves. So advocacy is such an important part of education. So really it's what we're talking about is quite a challenging topic of, finding your voice, but really about like standing up to your manager. That's what we initially discussed. And I know that can be a bit of a touchy subject for some people. What is for you, I guess, what's the importance of this topic? Why are you speaking up about this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I think, the touchiness that you referred to, I think definitely has been experienced when I've raised this in other forums. And I think for me, I absolutely recognize that there are so many wonderful managers and leaders in the sector. There really are so many wonderful people doing wonderful things. But if we're honest, there are also people that aren't good managers that are managing settings and aren't good leaders leading settings. And unfortunately, that does have challenges. It means that people that are great people working in settings might leave, might be unhappy. And of course, children are very aware of these sorts of things. So if there is discontent in teams, that will be picked up on by children. That will lead to children being less settled. And ultimately, like you said, we're advocating for all stakeholders in the sector, not just staff, not just children, but everyone and the families these children come from. So for me, if we can empower individuals and give them a sense of collectiveness, I think if we recognize their strength as we are together, rather than seeing ourselves as competition with each other, for example, we can really come together and find that common ground. We all obviously love the children we work with, and I think if we can really focus on that and do what we think is best for the children, we can find the courage to use our voice and stand up to things that we don't believe in.
Yeah, so it's a lot bigger than just us, isn't it? It's not that we have a problem with something and it's about us as individuals. Actually, it's because we're doing it for the children, like you say, who are the most important thing in our work, or I guess like more so for the greater good kind of thing. So when you say there are some people out there that might not be good managers and leaders, a lot of that comes down, I guess, to the lack of training, because a lot of educators, a lot of practitioners go on to being leaders or managers without that formal training, or maybe not even any informal training. They kind of maybe fall into the roles a lot of the time.
Absolutely. And I think it happens across education as well. I think you see the best teachers become heads of years or heads of pastoral, or the best nursery teachers become room leaders. And because they're a wonderful teacher and educator, it doesn't mean they're going to be a wonderful room leader or leader of others. And I think it's wrong to assume they will be, particularly as you mentioned, without any sense of guidance or informal training. I mean, of course, formal training would be great, but that is a whole other conversation about how, what's good training, what's good development for leaders, what's good education for leaders. But I think it's about recognizing or not assuming that somebody being a great educator means they'll be a great leader of other educators.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I've discussed with my partner actually before how people get promoted into roles that they're actually not going to be great at, and what they're really great at and what they're really passionate about, it gets kind of left behind. And just because they're so fantastic at their job doesn't mean that they need to be promoted. They need to stay within that job because they are so great at it and really capitalize on what they're doing.
And I think what's central to standing up to your manager is a sense of confidence as well. And I think if you're doing what something you're great at, you're working with the children as a key person, as a key worker, leading activities, role modeling best practice, you can own that and be really confident in it. But as soon as you start to step out of that comfort zone, which is a good thing to a point, you start to lose a bit of confidence and therefore are less likely to stand up for what you believe in because you're less sure that that's the right thing to do. So I think there's a sort of ripple effect, I suppose, when people do get promoted. And of course, it's good to embrace discomfort, but there's a point at which that discomfort becomes stress and becomes unhealthy. And that's where we need to recognize the support's needed.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've definitely had situations myself where I felt like I'm stepping out of my comfort zone and I should be embracing it, but sometimes it was just too much and almost like too soon, or lack of training, lack of confidence steps in, and then you have that imposter syndrome and kind of regress even more, rather than feeling like, oh, this is big step that I'm taking and I'm really, really ready to do the best I can in this job and like really throw myself into it. Instead, there's too many doubts that come in.
And I think for with my team at Always Grow, one thing I try to instill from the start through induction, and we give them all the book, the Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. There's an animation at Christmas as well. It's a wonderful book, Charlie McKeesey, I think. But what I love about that is the hidden messages, or not even hidden, but the messages within what he's saying in his book, and things like, we have so far to go, said the boy, but the horse responds, but look how far we've come. And I think, that kind of stuff is just so powerful, and to try to instill that in your team. I want my team to stand up to me. My team do stand up to me. And I think that's brilliant. And I want them to do that because they're the experts. They spend the time with the children. They know what they need better than me. And I think it's really important that they feel able to say to me what they think without fear of, being wrong. And they might suggest something that isn't possible, and that's okay. It doesn't make them bad or lesser because of their suggestion being not possible. It just means that it's not possible. It's not personal. It's practical sometimes.
And I think it really, like your attitude within all of this about really being open to your team members standing up to you and questioning you as well, and being curious and maybe critiquing you and your approach, really moves away from that that mindset of like, we've always done it this way and it's always been like this, and actually instead thinking, well, why do we always do it this way? Maybe we can do things differently. Is this the best approach, or are we just stuck in our ways now?
I'm so pleased you mentioned curiosity, of being curious. Like, my team actually take the mick at me a little bit if that be my favorite word about being curious. And I think it's like, we have 4 pillars at Always Growing. It's about forming reassuring relationships, communicating clearly, being continuously curious, and an enabling environment. But that third one, being continuously curious, I think it helps with all of them, because if you act in a certain way, if you're my colleague, I can think, well, you're being grumpy today, you're in a bad mood, and then just sort of give you the cold shoulder. Or you could be curious and think, well, I wonder, what's been going on with Angelica? Is she okay? She got something happen at the weekend? Like, did she have to skip breakfast because she was running late today? Like, and just be a bit more curious. And then that can instantly break down those barriers that people have between themselves, can promote communication. And then as a result, you've formed a more reassuring relationship, and the whole environment is more enabling because you're on the level with each other. You understand each other. You understand what's making you tick, what helps, what hinders, and then you can sort of work together for everyone. I think is so important.
Yeah, it definitely reminds me of the phrase. I think I might have picked it up from a podcast episode. I can't remember which one outside of education, but it really speaks about curiosity over judgment. So, like you're saying, to just be curious first rather than just think of something's, they're being grumpy or something. Actually try and understand why, what's going on, and really question. And I guess that really shows that care and attention and empathy, especially from a leader.
Yeah, and like, care and education, the educare debate in early years, caring or education. I've spoken to colleagues in higher education about this, that actually we consider perhaps early years as, let's say, 90% care, 10% education. And then we move into primary school, maybe it's 70% care, 30% education. Then secondary is 50%, 50, maybe even more education than care. And then higher education is maybe 20% care and 80% education. But what I think we need is just have 50% care, 50% education. We have to do both. If we can't, throughout from early years through to higher education, if we don't care for people, people won't feel safe. And if people don't feel safe, they can't engage. And if they can't engage, they can't learn. And then what's the point in all of this, So I think education and care, and this is when I said I might get on my soapbox a little bit, but care, I think if we, the idea of care is almost used as like a bad thing. Like in early years, people don't want to call it even early years education and care. They want to call it early years education. But I think care is what makes early years so special. And actually, I think every stage of education can learn about the wonderful care that we give. Of course, we're not going to necessarily go around hugging secondary school students and like having a cuddle with them on our laps. That's not the point of this, but that's how a 2-year-old sometimes needs to feel cared for, and a 17-year-old will have their own way of wanting to feel cared, and so will a 30-year-old early years educator have their way. And so it's not about having a cuddle with them, it's about recognizing what they need to feel cared for and seeing that as a strength of early years, something that we do wonderfully well and something we should celebrate rather than see as almost a weakness, that because we care we aren't teachers, for example. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And some of those things that you mentioned about the different, I guess, care needs and preferences of young adults and children reminds me of what we talk about. I guess Tamsin Grimmer talks about this a lot. And recently I recorded a podcast episode with Enya Last, a director of a nursery and of director of EduFeel, and she talked about love languages for adults as well, so for your team. So with Tamsin Grimmer, we've talked before around, children have different love languages. They may not want to be touched or cuddled, or they may want you to sit down and listen to them. And the same for adults as well, and young adults and team members. So it's really important to consider, how do your team want to be cared for, listened to, empathized with? How do they feel? What's best for them in terms of feeling that you as an employer care about them?
And I think it makes me think of two things, what you just said there. It's not necessarily treating people how you want to be treated, it's treating people how they want to be treated. And that doesn't mean you pander to everyone's needs and at the expense of yourself. I actually try to encourage people in Always Growing to think about their selfish indicator, and particularly some senior of the team actually not seeing being selfish as a bad thing, because sometimes you have to be selfish and look after yourself, because you can't help others if you're on your knees, metaphorically. The other thing it makes you think about is, I'm really new to the literature around leading with love, but I'm starting to explore the idea of, in a psychological sense, actually, of leading with love. But I really am curious to think about what that means to me, to you, to other people that are leaders, or in a formal sense or not. Because I think there's some potential, really some potential power in leading with love. And again, that doesn't mean that you just show unbiased care to everybody, and no matter what, you're there for them. You do need that, but you also need to challenge. So I think it's not mistaking love for unconditional care. It's about challenge and support and respect as well. And it, like love might be, and appreciate love is a word that we can probably define in different ways, but I'm interested to consider what it means to lead with love and how that can help leaders be better leaders.
Hiya! Just quickly, I wanted to ask a favour from all of the listeners and viewers. It would really help this podcast if you subscribe on the platform you are listening or watching on. This will help the Voice of Early Childhood podcast to continue putting out thought-provoking and reflective episodes with a range of guests. And if you are enjoying listening to this podcast, please do share it with someone else who you think would love it too. And of course, as always, we encourage you to share your voice too. If you have reflections, thoughts, and comments, please do share this episode on social media with your comments and tag the Voice of Early Childhood. Let's keep these thought-provoking discussions going. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now. I guess there is that term professional love, isn't there? Just like professional curiosity as well. And yeah, that's something that I think we need to think more about. And I was just going to say, when you mentioned there about love, like meaning that you challenge people because you want them to progress, and by challenging them, encouraging them to come out of their comfort zone, you're actually helping them, encouraging them to grow, and that can be seen as love. So I think what I was going to come back to as well is when you allow your team to question you and challenge you, then I feel like they might be more open to criticism themselves as well, and being challenged by you as a leader as well.
Yeah, it's about that culture of openness, of like, I am definitely not perfect. I make mistakes. I try to be open about my mistakes. I apologize if I get something wrong. And I think you have to remember that this, as a leader in a formal sense, the standard you walk past is the standard you set. So if you do something, you have to then expect other people to think that that is okay to do. So if you want people to feel okay making mistakes, then you have to be okay making mistakes too. And I think that's a really valuable thing. And we're human. I'm really conscious as well, as when I talk about leaders and leadership, I try to remind myself and everyone that it's not reserved just for people who have the job title of manager or director or owner. Leadership is something that everyone can enact. I feel strongly about that, but only if the culture, I think, promotes it. So it does in some way rely on the formal manager, leader, owner having a culture where it's promoted, but ultimately anybody can be a leader of themselves and of others without a title as well.
And I guess that kind of goes back to what our original thought is around standing up to your manager, because if you don't have that culture of everyone can be a leader and everyone can challenge each other, if somebody who has not got that formal title of a leader does challenge a leader or a manager, then that is where things can become a little bit uncomfortable, and that's where those kind of barriers come into speaking up, and the fear of speaking up if you feel like there's something that isn't right, or at least you feel like things could be changed.
Absolutely. I think we have to recognize the power of diverse thinking. And, I see the world in a certain way, you'll see it differently. That's why together we'll probably come up with better ideas than either of us would by ourselves, generally speaking. And as a team, certainly in early years, I think to rely on just one voice is a really kind of dangerous way to do it. Not only because you're only hearing one voice, but that one person has such a weight on their shoulders that, it's going to wear them down. So it needs to be shared, and we need to embrace. It can be hard sometimes if you're a perfectionist, for example. I know a lot of earlier professionals obviously like things a very particular way, and that's a wonderful way and it's brilliant, but it's also okay if it's not exactly that way. And if it means that you're not working till 10 o'clock at night to get it the way you want it, then maybe that's okay. And I'm not trying to encourage a culture of accepting lower standards. Well, maybe I am to a point, as long as obviously those standards are still good. And I definitely don't mean that in an Ofsted sense of good, just to make that clear. I mean that in a holistic sense of good. As professionals, we can decide what's good and what's excellent.
And I guess it's up to, each individual to decide, and each setting, and potentially each manager and leader to decide what their priorities are and what is important to them and what should be that focus, because not everything can be given the same level of priority and the same level of time and effort. And this reminds me of what I often talk to my partner about, and we kind of disagree on this to an extent. Of I always say, like, how you do anything is how you do everything, and I kind of did strongly believe in that, in terms of thinking that if you, again, going back to being a perfectionist, if you care about things, attention to details, etc., then you should do everything in that way. But my partner actually says, when we have conversations about leadership, especially, it talks about the fact that there are certain things that will need more time and effort and priority, and some things that will just have to be just kind of completed and left, and as long as they're done, kind of thing. And and it really does depend on, yeah, like I say, on those priorities, on values as well, I guess, and what you do delegate your, especially as a leader, your time to. Like you said, if you're not spending all your time until 10 p.m. in the evening still working, actually maybe you're prioritizing your own mental health and well-being, so then you can be there for your team in the morning, rather than waking up grumpy, etc. So yeah, it really depends on what needs your priority maybe at that time. So it varies at different points as well. It doesn't mean you don't care about something.
Yeah, so there's so much that in what you just said there. I mean, I certainly agree with, and I think two main things that sticking with me is this, you mentioned about having a disagreement, and that doesn't mean that you and your partner don't care for each other. It means that you had a disagreement, and that's okay. And I think we can have constructive disagreements, constructive tension. Giving constructive feedback, I think, is so important, to feel okay to disagree with somebody and not, be worried, oh, they're going to hate me, or that kind of stuff. And the other thing is about this concept called rotated neglect. And like I have a few roles, and it means that sometimes I do I'm not able to prioritize everything that I want to prioritize. So I have to neglect something, and maybe it's uncomfortable to admit that you've neglected something. But if you're honest with yourself and realize you need to just put that down for a little bit so you can focus on this other thing. And like more holistically, I've heard this idea that everything in your life is like sitting on a table. So your work, your family, your pet, your hobbies is on the table. And sometimes those things will fall over, and that's okay. But your health is the table. And if the table falls over, then everything falls over. So I think it's about recognizing that your health is everything. And you've seen, I'm sure, lots of people listening have seen the impact of burnout and people leaving the sector for other jobs. And I think if we try to take a more holistic view of our health being the common denominator and making sure we prioritize that, at the expense of other people, sometimes at the expense of the setting, to look after yourself, I think there'll be a more sustainable situation for many managers and owners, particularly single site manager owners, that owner operators. I think that I mean that must be I don't do that. I have a really wonderful team around me. I have a lot of respect for people that do own operate solely. I think that's a huge undertaking.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I do love your analogy of the table. Actually, that's such a, yeah, I've not heard that before. I've heard people talk about, health being the priority and everything kind of, not working if your health isn't in a good place. But yeah, I love that analogy. And I guess it kind of is very much related to that, the thing of you can't be there for others if you can't take care of yourself. And a lot of the time that seems very kind of wishy-washy or a bit soppy, and people are told to just kind of get on with it, but it really is true, especially when we are talking about health. And sadly, we only generally realize the importance of health when we talk about physical health, rather than mental health. And it comes to a point where mental health gets that bad that then it's exhibited physically, but it all still stems from often mental health. So I think that's probably, well, it's a wider discussion in itself, but it's something to recognize in terms of, are we looking after our mental health? Like you mentioned, burnout, before it gets that bad, that then we only recognize it when we see the physical symptoms.
And I think, related back to the kind of core topic of our conversation about standing up to your manager, for example, that takes a lot of energy. And if you think about your energy levels and, if it's depleted and you're not recognizing that you need to recharge and look after your health, you aren't going to have the energy to think clearly, to formulate a plan, to have that difficult conversation. You're not going to want to face it. And certainly for myself personally, if I feel slightly overwhelmed or stressed, if I try to push through, the work I produce is not going to be of good quality that it could have been. And the conversations that I'm having aren't going to be as productive as they could have been if I just took a step back and, looked after myself a little bit. And I call it clearing the debris sometimes. Like I've got all this sort of, my laptop screen's got 6 tabs open and I haven't done that thing I needed to do for that person. So let me just stop this thing for a moment and clear the debris. Then I can return focused to have more productive conversations.
That's such a good point. Yeah, when you can then return with a clear mind and without all these things kind of nagging at you constantly. Yeah, that is so important. I feel like I'm currently in that state. Actually, there's so many things going on. Maybe after our podcast recording, I'll have to kind of clear the debris as well. It's a good
Yeah,
reminder.
definitely. And like, just for like people, like I really think it's important to control the bookends of your day. So like, whilst particularly in early years, who knows what's going to happen, what staff are going to phone in sick today, what children are going to be under the weather today or not be themselves today. You just don't know. So if you can control the start of your day and the end of your day, then at least that, and then the chaos in between, I think you're going to be more likely to be able to deal with effectively if you control the start and end if possible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I was just talking about that yesterday, actually, in terms of feeling like if I get up earlier and start work at least before 9, when, if working from home, then a lot of the emails and phone calls start coming in at 9 generally. But if I start at 8 or even early is even better, then I feel like I've got full control and, no one's emailed me yet or at least no one's called me yet. And I feel like, yeah, I'm already on top of the day rather than kind of starting at 8:30, 9, and there's already things that I'm almost like behind on, and people are expecting me to jump on things straight away, or like my time is not my own time. I don't decide what to work on. So yeah, that is a really, really good point. And then that at the end of the day, almost like a bit of a debrief with yourself, and that's when that time for reflection, I guess, is really important. That self-reflection as well, and maybe even I was going to mention actually for leaders to reflect on themselves in terms of have they been a good leader today, whatever good means to them and their teams. Have they allowed their teams to speak to them and to challenge them? Were they open to conversations and listening to others' voices?
Yeah, absolutely. I think then setting your priorities for the next day, and we spoke about priorities earlier, and I meant to say at the time that I've heard it before, if you have more than 2 priorities, you don't actually have any. You need to really focus on what's that thing that you need to do tomorrow for yourself. And I think managers in nurseries, owners in nurseries can often get pulled into what you might describe as urgent but not important. And you need to try to stay away from that as much as possible and focus on the important things. And that's really hard sometimes because you do get dragged into the nitty gritty, to the details. And then that like comes full circle that if you can empower your team to be confident, to use their voice, then actually there probably will be less things that you need to deal with personally because they can deal with them themselves. And I think in the end, it might take more work at the start, but in the end, it actually saves you time, but it requires time to get it going. That delayed gratification will come eventually.
When you mentioned urgent but not important, I always, I'm really bad with this. I always say, but everything's important. I've got to get everything done. Everything's important. And like, when you say about 2 priorities and you don't have any, actually that kind of as soon as you said that, I was like, oh God, yeah, you know what? You're right. That kind of really reflected inwards on myself and thought, I'm really bad at that. So yeah, definitely that reflection element is so vital. And when you mentioned delegating there as well, I think that is so important for leaders. And again, it's creating a space, I guess, where everybody feels like their voices can be heard, and a safe space where they feel like they can share anything really, and share challenges and speak up. So that delegating becomes a little bit kind of more normal, I guess. So then people don't feel like there's all this added pressure and they're constantly being given more and more piled on. Actually, they can also say, oh, this is too much right now, or I've already started on this. Can I delegate to someone else? So everything being really open and not having people suffer in silence, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what we've been talking about really, if people are interested in the term, I think psychological safety. So people are interested in searching that up a bit more, but feeling able to speak up, to take risks, to make mistakes, to fail, and not see failure as necessarily a bad thing. It's a really excellent way to learn, is to fail. So yeah, absolutely.
And I guess we encourage that of children all the time in terms of, the characteristics of effective learning, encouraging children to take risks, and to seek challenges, think of new ideas, and everything being new to children, really, try new things. So it is something that we're used to in terms of encouraging of children and that terminology and the concept of it all. It's just making sure that we encourage that of our teams of adults as well, and bring that into the leadership side of things with our teams and not just with children.
Yeah, and I think we can learn a lot from the way, we encourage independence of our children. We want them to, not necessarily strive for perfection. We want them to, be confident in themselves. We want them to be individuals. And somewhere along the line, we lose that as adults. I'm not sure exactly why or where or when. I'm sure it's different for everybody. But you have to just love the innocence of children and almost miss that level of, self belief and just comfort in self-contentness. I don't know what the word is really, but just that comfort in your own skin, and this is me. And that's not to mean that you don't have to care about what other people think to a point, but I think we can learn a lot from how we treat children and try to translate that into how we treat each other as professionals.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I mean, what's important to mention, probably maybe we haven't mentioned so far, is that kind of peer-to-peer support as well. We talked a lot about leadership and management and teams, but also we kind of mentioned delegating a little bit as well. I guess that's where it comes in. But yeah, really standing up for each other as well. And that's the same in terms of, I guess, like we mentioned, the leaders can challenge their teams and the teams can challenge their leaders, but also challenging each other and also being there for each other and looking out for each other. And those networks are so important, I guess, internally and externally as well in early childhood, because a lot of the time we can feel almost, although we work in teams, sometimes feel a little bit lonely because we are with the children a lot of the time and everything's so fast paced and there's so many routines and things to get done that there's not enough time for us as educators, for us as employees, as team members to be, like you mentioned earlier, actually be a little bit more selfish.
Yeah, and I think as a nursery, let's think as a nursery organization being a bit selfish, that we have 5 INSET days a year that we close the nursery for. Parents are still essentially charged for those days. And we do that for a very good reason, so we can come together with space, with time to think, to reflect, to change, to do, to do the things that you simply cannot do. When you're in the under 2 space and you've got 2 settlers that are on one on each knee that just don't want to leave you because they're just settling in. That's about getting through the day and ensuring that they feel as settled as possible. You can't be thinking about professional development and I need to revamp the cozy area whilst you're in that moment. You need to be there for the children. So I think having it's only 5 days, it isn't enough really. But I think that level of selfishness, if you like, I think is completely justified. And any parent that thinks it isn't, I would really happily have a productive conversation with them about trying to explain why. And our parents, I think, are very happy with the work we do and the level of professionalism we have. And I think it's partly down to that culture that we've created. The INSET days are really part of that, and the approach we have to our teachers.
It's all about feeding back to the setting, to the children and families, isn't it? Everything that you're doing, those INSET days are about making sure that your team and your setting can be the best they can be for the children and families that they're working with.
Exactly. And if we respect our teams and look after our teams, there's much more chance that they're going to respect and look after you as well. And the children, I just think that, as you've alluded to, is just better for everyone and ultimately better for the children, which is why when you strip it all back, we're doing what we do.
And I think the last point that I'd want to bring up here actually is having challenging conversations. I know that's something that you feel really strongly about, the importance of having these conversations. And a lot of what we talked about today really is kind of very much around challenging conversations, because when you speak up, about something, if you feel uncomfortable, it will be a challenging conversation to say, I don't agree with this, or, there's a better way of doing this. But how do you encourage that, I guess, that space? How do you facilitate that safe space, that psychological safety to have these challenging conversations about all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, so let's be honest, difficult conversations don't really get easier the more you have them in many ways, because every conversation that's difficult is unique to that situation, to the person you have to have it with, about the context you have to have it around. But I do think that sometimes you need to recognize that you sometimes just need a burst of courage. You need 20 seconds of courage to start that conversation. And then once you're in it, you're in it. But I think it's about being completely honest and say, I need to have a difficult conversation with you, and I don't really want to have this conversation, but my feelings about the conversation aren't as important as having that conversation with you, and focusing on why you need to have that conversation. So there's a lot of preparation, I think, that goes into difficult conversations. And this absolutely isn't the purpose of me being here, but if people are interested, there is a free course that I'll maybe post on my LinkedIn that I put together around having a difficult conversation through leadership development stuff I'm working on. Like, it's just sort of a framework, I suppose, for approaching difficult conversations, because I see that in every industry that I've ever connected with, that difficult conversations are difficult. And if you don't think they're difficult, then, maybe there's an issue there with your empathy and your emotional, state. But I think it's about recognizing that no one really likes difficult conversations. But one thing I would say is that I'm not sure I've ever felt worse after a difficult conversation. Certainly not like the day after, maybe immediately after I felt really uncomfortable. But, if you have it properly and you prepare and you sort of, frame it correctly, everyone, I think, is going to feel better afterwards. And I have yet to really see a situation where that difficult conversation hasn't led to that eventually.
I think that's a really good point that you make about preparation, and the fact that it takes time to prepare for it, and the fact that you also have like training on that seems like it would be really, really useful, because we don't get prepared for having difficult conversations. We don't have that, do we, in terms of in school, in early years, as adults in training, from our parents. Really, it's not really something that is ever spoken about, or it's not really a thing, is it?
And thinking about nurseries particularly, you've got ratios. So let's think practically, how are you going to have a difficult conversation with someone in your team if you've got to be in the room? So you asked, I didn't completely answer your question, I suppose, when you said, how do I create that environment where it's possible? I think we have a structure where we've got people that are supernumerary outside of ratios that hopefully, even if they're not the ones having the conversation, they can step into ratios, so the people that need to have the conversation can have that conversation outside of the room. And I appreciate that might be seen as a luxury in some settings, but I think you have to make the time. You have to encourage people to have an hour meeting after, have not necessarily a whole hour, but, have a weekly team meeting and maybe use some of that time for it. So you can have that conversation in the environment that maybe isn't with children jumping all over you and trying to, you can focus on it then as well. So I think that practical point is, how do you set up a conversation? Like, we wouldn't have this podcast interview probably in the middle of a busy high street, because it wouldn't be practical. We've done it
in a setting, in a busy setting with children all over the place.
Exactly. We've chosen an environment that's appropriate for the context of the conversation. I think you need to do that as well when you're having difficult conversations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Those practical elements, as well as the more emotional, I guess, and then preparing yourself. And I really like how you said about framing it as well, in terms of actually saying out loud, like, I want to have this is going to be a difficult conversation, and almost preparing yourself and that person that you're going to have it with.
Exactly. And no one really likes surprises. I mean, maybe on your birthday you do, but no one really likes bad surprises. So I think if you can be as transparent as possible, and one small thing actually, as from an owner's perspective, I don't like it when a team member, like, we use WhatsApp a lot. I really encourage them. I'm always WhatsApping the team so I can reach out when they can want to reach out to me, they can. But I say, if they want to have a conversation with me, at least say, hey Lewis, can I talk to you about X? Don't just say, hey Lewis, can I talk to you tomorrow, please? That's not that kind, because I'm then thinking
what's happened.
Are they okay? Should I phone them? Like, how serious is this? They want to hand their notice in. Has someone done something really wrong? So I think, be open and really help that person prepare for the conversation. Because if you said to me, like, oh, let's do a podcast interview, and then that was it, full stop, it wouldn't be as good of a conversation. The fact, like, let's do a podcast about standing up to your manager, we can then prepare for it and think about what we want to say a bit more. And it's the same for any conversation, no matter how small. If you can help the other person be as their best version of themselves in the conversation, then you should do that.
Especially when it is a difficult conversation, you want both people to feel prepared in terms of at least being, I guess, like self-regulated as well. That's probably an important part.
Yeah, and making sure that they know that it, you know, the why you're having. I think the purpose. No one likes being asked to do something that just doesn't make sense. You know, so I think if you can really provide rationale for, you know, if you're standing up to a manager, you know, what is the problem? You know, explain it from your perspective, why this matters to you. I think we're all human and we all have feelings, and we need to recognize that and just be kind to each other. And also, I think it's really important to say that kindness and niceness, I think, are different things. Like, being kind doesn't always mean you've got to be nice. Sometimes it can be the kindest thing to say, that's not okay, or I don't like that, you know, and challenge somebody can be the kindest thing to do. So always being nice isn't the answer either.
That's a really interesting distinction there. I've noted that down to have a good reflection on it myself and different scenarios. Actually, that's. I think we'll leave it there for us and for the listeners and viewers. And that's a great reflection point. Being kind doesn't always mean being nice. What does that actually mean to you? Yeah. So we'll leave it there. Thank you, Lewis, very much for talking about this challenging topic, sharing your views and your experiences as well. And so Lewis's article can be found on the Voice of Early Childhood website. The link is in this episode description. And also, for those who are listening or watching, if you enjoyed this episode, please do share it with your colleagues and on your social media, and do tag us as well. We can so we can engage in discussions. Tag the Voice of Early Childhood and also Lewis and myself. So on LinkedIn we are just Lewis Fogarty. Is that right? That is just how you appear on LinkedIn. and myself, Angelica Celinska. So do engage with us as well, and carry on the discussions and debates potentially, and pose your views. And you might also enjoy the episode with Carla Ward, all about yes spaces, which talks about saying yes more and why that's important in leadership as well as with young children, as well as the episode around educator wellbeing with Enya Last, which talks about supporting our teams' needs and really understanding them and their wellbeing. Some of the things that we touched on today. So thank you very much once again, Lewis. It's been great having this discussion with you. I feel like I've got lots to take away with me and lots of reflections. So it's always great to have that.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure. And as you said, this is hopefully going to lead to more discussions. This is just the start of more engagement, hopefully.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.